Good. So, welcome back. So, over the last number of weeks, since the start of the year, really, somewhere in January, we've been looking at the life of the Buddha, and Maitreya Bandhu and Subhadramati have been looking at this life in not just a historical way, in fact, not really in a historical way, but in more of a mythic way, a sort of imaginative journey of the Buddha as it's come down to us through myth and legend, and seeing if we can draw out, or they can draw out, parallels that are relevant for us. That are, if a myth is a real myth, then it's timeless. The sort of parables or the meaning of a myth is universal and is applicable, even though we're living in a very, very different time and an age and a place to when the Buddha was alive. And I want to carry on. We're going to carry on looking at the life of the Buddha, but more we're going to be looking at his teachings. We'll be looking at the people that he met and what he taught them over the next few weeks. And as I say, we're going to be drawing our inspiration from this book, a lovely, lovely book, actually. You can get it in hardback or in paperback now. It's by somebody called Vishwapani Blomfield, and it's called Gautama Buddha. It's a biography of the Buddha, for want of a better word. But it draws... You can't really talk about the Buddha without talking about his teachings. So it draws on some of the earliest suttas that are still in existence, and pieces together a life that includes the key dharmic teachings. Really, really recommend this book. And I'm going to just pick up the story from where Maitreya Bandhu left off probably 2 weeks ago. So if you were here a couple of weeks ago, Maitreya Bandhu, I wasn't here, so you might have to correct me if I'm wrong, but he said to me anyway that he'd been talking about the first time that the Buddha taught. It's referred to as the first turning of the wheel. The wheel of the Dharma was set in motion when the Buddha was able to not just teach, but actually communicate his own enlightenment experience, his own vision that had opened up for him internally. He'd managed to communicate that to others in a way that allowed the same experience to open up for them. So by the end of this first teaching, there were 6 enlightened beings. It said that there were 6 enlightened beings in the world. There was the Buddha and 5 others. The 5 others had been friends and perhaps even followers of his before he gained enlightenment. And it said that all 5 of them had practiced extreme austerities, mortifying the flesh, torturing the body, in the belief that that would liberate the mind. And you can still sort of encounter that sort of belief and those sorts of practices in modern day India, people doing all sorts of incredible tortures, self-mortifications, in the belief that it's going to liberate the mind. And the Buddha had done similar practices alongside of them. So there were 6 of these wandering sort of holy men who were practicing extreme mortification of the flesh, starving themselves. I've heard of people in India sort of holding a hand up for years till it withers. All sorts of things. But the Buddha, this is before he became enlightened, so it was the Buddha to be at the time, Shakyamuni, had decided that this didn't work, that this was all a mistake, that torturing the body to the point of death almost, that's what he'd done, wasn't going to liberate the mind in the way that he was searching for, it wasn't going to lead to enlightenment. So he had taken a different turn and started eating, and had an intuition that meditation was going to be the way. The 5 others, his 5 friends, had abandoned him in disgust because they just thought he was a weakling who had now given up on the one true path because he'd decided to eat. And so they'd gone off, and presumably they'd carried on practicing together as a band of 5. So the Buddha, when he gained enlightenment, wanted to communicate his experience, and he chooses these 5 people, and he travels all the way he walks from Bodh Gaya, which is where he gained enlightenment, to the outskirts of Varanasi, modern-day Varanasi, to a place which at the time was called Isipatana, and today is known as Sarnath. And there he finds these 5 and starts to teach them the Dharma, starts to teach them what he'd discovered. And initially they're resistant because they think he's just taken a wrong turning, he's sold out, how could he have discovered the truth when he'd abandoned the true path for a life of luxury and indulgence. That's how they saw it. But eventually, one by one, they see, they understand, but more importantly, they experience what he'd experienced. And it's at that point that, in a way, the Dharma was set in motion. Had the Buddha not been able to communicate his experience to anybody else, then Buddhism would have died with the Buddha. There would have been no Dharma, there would have been no teaching that reaches down to us. So those 5 first disciples are sort of key in the whole lineage of Buddhism. It's said that it was so significant that the early suttas talk about it in mythic terms. The language they use is that the whole of the cosmos was celebrating this communication of enlightenment. Beings in all the heavenly realms, which there's a whole sort of stack of heavenly planes with different, more and more heavenly beings. All of them rejoice at the communication of this vision, and they say that the wheel of the Dharma has now been set in motion because of the enlightenment of these other 5. But I want to pick up the story from what happens next. And what happens next is, the next person to really respond to the teaching of the Buddha is a young man called Yasa. And Yasa is quite an unlikely next disciple. He's a wealthy playboy. If you can imagine that, in India of 2,500 years ago, it's said that he had several pleasure palaces, and his life was extremely cosseted, extremely comfortable, and really just partying was what it consisted of. Yeah, just probably partying all the time and sleeping during the day was Yasa's kind of life. And it's said that he'd been partying one night in one of his palaces, and at some point, I guess, he fell asleep, and he was probably drunk, as were all the other, his friends and all the, he probably had a retinue, a harem and a retinue of courtesans who were entertaining him. And anyway, he wakes up very early in the morning and looks around him, and there's a scene of, well, it's the morning after kind of experience. It's the morning after experience writ large. And what Yasa sees is all these kind of still drunken, stupefied, sleeping people, bodies, all around him. I guess they were beautiful people, but when you look at them in the morning light, when he looks at them, they don't look beautiful. The texts talk about how some of them were dribbling, some of them were snoring, all of them were dishevelled, their clothes were all over the place, and probably there was worse, because that doesn't sound too bad, but something in Yasa, there was probably worse. It looked probably a right mess. And something in Yasa is revolted. He experiences this revulsion at the sort of ugliness, the tawdriness of the scene. It's can you relate to that? Can you kind of relate to this kind of? He's probably hungover. There's probably this sense of, what am I doing? All the sort of glamour and glitter of the night before is now cheap and stale. I mean, in my own much younger years, I can remember sort of similar kind of, well, I can remember my 18th birthday, and I'd gone out drinking and partying with friends, and I thought I'd had a good time. I have a vague memory of the night bus home, and I don't. There's something about night buses home, the horribleness of all of that. Even as a young man, I sort of remember the horribleness of that. I sort of managed to make it home, and then was promptly sick. Yeah. And I can sort of remember thinking, oh, now I'm 18. And there was a sort of mixture of, I'm glad I had a lot of drink and a good time. But somewhere in me, I kind of knew this was horrible. I wasn't enjoying it. I wasn't enjoying, probably after the first few drinks, I probably didn't enjoy it. Does that? I'm probably not the only one. Tell me I'm not the only one. I didn't learn my lesson then. It took me well into my 20s of similar kind of behaviour before. Well, anyway, I won't go on anyway, but there came a point when that sort of thing just didn't appeal anymore. It didn't feel like a good time to be wandering around trying not to throw up everywhere. Anyway, Yasa has this kind of turning about. So it doesn't. We're not told how old he is, but he wakes up, and it's this moment of the morning after. He's horrified, revolted. He says it's horrible, it's fearful, and all he can do is run out of the house, run out of the palace. So it's very, very early morning. He puts on his shoes, which happen to be made of golden fabric. So it's kind of, he puts on his golden slippers, we're told, and runs out of the house, screaming, "It's horrible! It's horrible! It's fearful! It's horrible!" And of course, he more or less runs into the Buddha. The Buddha is still staying in Sarnath, and so Yasa must have lived just in the town, and he runs towards the park, which is where the Buddha was staying, this deer park. And the Buddha's decided to get up early. Maybe he always got up early, and he's just doing walking meditation. So he's mindfully walking up and down. I guess all the other 5 disciples are, well, they're probably still asleep. The Buddha's walking up and down, and he sees Yasa coming towards him, sort of in a bit of a stupor, probably, saying, "It's horrible, it's horrible." And well, the Buddha immediately addresses him by saying, "Come here, Yasa. I can teach you something that isn't horrible. This is not terrible. This is not fearful. This is not horrible." So I want to just pause there before saying any more about what happens with Yasa. What I find interesting is that this disciple, who's come after the initial 5, this disciple hasn't been a truth seeker. He's been a pleasure seeker. The other 5 were practicing these ascetic practices because they were after ultimate truth. So they really were seekers. They were really, really serious about the quest, to the point of probably being prepared to die for the truth, torturing the body. There was something incredibly earnest and driven and, in a certain sense, noble about their quest, even if they were on the wrong track. So perhaps it wasn't surprising that they were the first people to wake up to what the Buddha had woken up to, because they were already striving very, very hard, very, very earnestly. But Yasa hasn't been striving. I suspect he'd never really thought about any other quest other than partying and enjoying himself as much as he could. He was a hedonist. He was not a truth seeker. He was just a pleasure seeker. He'd been driven by craving, just his desire for pleasure. And personally, I identify more with Yasa than I do with those other 5 truth seekers. Not that I don't have a truth-seeking, questing nature, I do, but I also am a pleasure seeker. I know that. And certainly I've never mortified my body knowingly. I'm too fond of cake and all sorts of other comforts, worldly kind of creaturely comforts, to really feel much identity with those first 5 disciples. But with Yasa, I can think, oh yeah, no, I can relate to this hedonism, this urge for pleasure. And I suspect that if the Buddha were alive today, he'd look at our contemporary culture and society and see all of us, maybe not all, but most of us, he'd see our culture as extremely hedonistic, extremely geared towards pleasure rather than meaning. Yeah, so Yasa is, I think, if he has a symbolic significance, he's a sort of symbol for our hedonism gone out of control, our sort of rampant craving for ever greater sense experience, ever greater luxury and comfort. Even though somewhere along the line, most of us, I'm looking around, some of you are very young in my eyes, but most of you probably know that it doesn't really ultimately work. If you don't know that, sorry. Sorry to have to tell you now. But it won't ultimately lead to lasting fulfillment. Of course, pleasure is pleasurable, and in a certain sense, as I'll go on to explore, there's nothing wrong with pleasure. In fact, I was encouraging you to look for pleasure in your meditation earlier on. Pleasure in itself is not wrong. It's not sinful. Buddhism doesn't have this sort of Puritan attitude to pleasure. It doesn't have this notion that pleasure is somehow bad or sinful. In fact, sin isn't a Buddhist concept at all. In a way, pleasure is, I think Maitreya Bandhu was exploring this a bit, pleasure's a natural, healthy urge in human beings, the desire for pleasure, the need for pleasure even. And if our lives didn't have any pleasure in them, I think they'd be intolerable. So Buddhism doesn't make a problem out of pleasure. What it's saying is that a life lived purely for pleasure, if that's where all of our emotional urge, all of our volitional energy is going, just for pure pleasure, then it doesn't work. Partly what happens is you get diminishing returns. Yeah, perhaps that's what happened to Yasa. The first maybe month or few years of partying might have been fine for Yasa. There comes a point where you've sort of done it to excess, and you get diminishing returns. Of course, Yasa didn't have this problem, but for many people, you get the issue of addiction, which then spirals us into pain. The pleasure turns to pain and suffering. What was once very exciting starts to become torture. So there's that aspect of pleasure, or life just lived for pleasure. Diminishing returns, possibly something like addiction. But maybe more subtly, I think the human heart and mind is much bigger than just the desire for pleasure. There's something in us that is never going to be satisfied with sense experience, even if that sense experience is extremely pleasurable. There's something in us that wants meaning. That meaning is going to be found in, it might be accompanied by pleasure, but it's not going to be just found in sense experience. It's often found in connection with others. It's often found in love. It's often found in experiences of beauty. It might be found in creative acts. It might be found in generosity and kindness. It might be found in the pursuit of some intellectual endeavour. But it's seldom likely to be found just through, party. Yeah? There's something in us that wants more than just sense pleasure. So do you agree with that? Does that, yeah? It's strange though, isn't it? Because I think when we think about it, like I've just talked about, it seems rationally kind of true, probably nobody would argue with this. At least nobody that comes here probably would argue with that. And yet, we're very seduced by the world around us that does keep insisting that just by having more excitement, more goodies, more pleasurable experiences, you can achieve ultimate happiness. It keeps insisting that. So in a way, think about our lives and think about how seduced are we by that notion. And I believe that, speaking for myself, I know that I do get seduced, even though I'm practicing Buddhism and working here and living here, and I do get seduced. I do get seduced by thinking that, oh, if I only had the next, I don't know, Apple gadget or something, that life would be that much better. I spent about a year craving an iPad, and I already have a laptop. I don't have any need for an iPad. I tried to convince myself. I sometimes go away to meetings away from here, and I thought, oh, an iPad is so much more portable than my laptop is. But actually my laptop's fairly portable. That's what laptops are like. I work from home, so my laptop is in my room, in my bedroom. So I was thinking, well, a tablet would, I don't know, well, I could use it on my armchair. But I couldn't think of anything that I needed a tablet for. Anyway, it took me the best part of a year to somehow get over myself and think, no, you don't need a tablet computer. Definitely don't need an iPad. I have an iPhone that is a second-hand one that somebody gave me, and I don't know how to use it. I mean, I do make phone calls and send text messages, but that is pretty much all I can do. But nevertheless, even at my age, when I'm not into technology and gadgets, and really I don't know what I'd do with more, even at my age I was really seduced. And had I not been trying to practice mindfulness and some degree of renunciative kind of tendency, then I would have splashed out and got one. So I know how seductive this whole game of pleasure through consuming more can be. Anyway, Yasa. Going back to Yasa, he meets the Buddha, doesn't know who the Buddha is, but the Buddha, Yasa's in a state, and the Buddha just says, sit here and I'll show you something that isn't horrible, isn't fearful. And he starts to teach Yasa the Dharma. And first of all, what's really interesting is he starts to just teach Yasa about generosity and other people. And it's almost like he's just saying, look, there's more than your hedonistic, self-centered desires. You can be generous. There are other people around you. Look around. There are other people who you can be generous to. And that is a healthy thing to do. It's like Yasa, I imagine, was quite a self-centered, spoilt young man who's probably never had to really think about others, not in a sense of empathy. Probably other people were just people that he could have a good time with, in a sort of utilitarian kind of way. So the Buddha teaches him about kindness, he teaches him about generosity, he teaches him about how pleasure can be found through connection, We don't exactly know what the Buddha taught, but it's something along those lines. He starts with teaching about ethics and other people, and generosity and beauty. And the Buddha is famous for meeting whoever he meets at their level and talking in their terms. So I imagine that to Yasa, he talked about pleasure. He talked about higher pleasures, the pleasures that you can have, not through drink and drugs and partying, but through being content and still and open-hearted, and the pleasures that come from an expansive consciousness. Interesting in meditation, and he may have taught Yasa to meditate, in meditation you can experience pleasure, sort of physical pleasure, as well as emotional pleasure, that is more pleasurable than any sense experience you've ever had. It's more pleasurable than sex. It's more pleasurable than, I don't know, recreational drugs might be. All of that is open to you through meditation. Now, the trouble is, it's not maybe so accessible as, I don't know, taking a tablet. It's not going to be so easy. You have to work at it. But if you start to stumble upon pleasure in meditation, it can be the most satisfying thing that you can experience, short of enlightenment itself. Tremendous sort of richness in meditative pleasure. And all you're doing is sitting quietly following your breath. It's amazing that the mind, our own consciousness, harbours in potential form such fulfillment, such depth of joy and beauty and pleasure is there in potential in all human consciousness. That's amazing, and that we don't see it ordinarily, and yet we're questing after it all the time, yearning for it all the time, and it's there, just if we turn towards it and open the door of our mind. So this is the sort of thing that he starts to teach Yasa. And then when Yasa is more open-hearted and open-minded, when he's calmed down, when his mind is clear, the Buddha then starts to teach him about the nature of reality itself, how everything is not only transient and impermanent and ungraspable, but he also teaches him about how everything that we experience is of a constructed nature. Our very sense of self is a construct. Our very sense of other is a construct. Our very sense of the world is a construct. And then we live within those constructed conceptual frameworks, and that keeps mind small. That keeps us small. So he teaches Yasa about the nature of reality, and Yasa has a realization. He sees what the Buddha is talking about. He experiences at least a glimpse of that for himself. He doesn't become fully enlightened just at that point, but he does, for himself, see the truth of the Buddha's teaching, has a direct experience of it. What I imagine is that being in the presence of the Buddha itself was a teaching, itself was an experience that had a profound impact on Yasa. So not just the Buddha's words. I could repeat the words, but Yasa was being taught by the Buddha himself. The Buddha, fresh from his enlightenment experience, was sitting next to Yasa, teaching him, and the power of the Buddha's consciousness. If somebody was at all receptive, could reach right into their consciousness and elevate it. A while back, I was giving a talk here in January, and I was talking about having met my own teacher recently, Sangha, and we were sitting talking about this and that, nothing very special. He was asking me about the LBC and retreats and who was coming along, are we getting a range. He's 91 and blind, almost blind, and frail, but very, very interested in our centres, our movement. Particularly, are we getting a diverse range of people coming along in terms of age, in terms of ethnicity? He was sort of asking me all those sorts of things, and so it's quite an ordinary conversation. We weren't talking about the nature of reality. We weren't talking about the Dharma, not explicitly. And all I can say is that a few minutes into the conversation, I felt my mind expand as if I was in a deep meditation. But I wasn't in a deep meditation. I was chatting. But I felt my consciousness become bigger and brighter and brighter. And there was more and more metta in my experience. And I kind of had a sense that his mind that I was being influenced by. Of course, I can't prove that. It could have been sort of self-induced, but it was a very tangible experience, and I know what expansive mind is like because I can experience it in meditation, but I don't always experience that level of it in conversation with somebody. Now, I can just use that as a imaginative sort of personal example, an imaginative sort of stepping stone to what it might have been like to sit in the presence of the Buddha who was newly enlightened. It's said that the Buddha was, as a young man, and he would have been a young man then, he was in his mid-30s, he was enlightened at 35, I think. It said that he was a very impressive figure, that he was, even just his being, his body, his presence was very, very impressive. It was said that he was very good looking, he was handsome, he was well built, it said that he had this kind of golden complexion, a sort of certain sort of star quality about him. People were immediately attracted to him. And then, of course, there's this mind, that this consciousness that had never been encountered in the world before. So anyway, Yasa has this realization. And he asks to go forth. So what Yasa's doing is he's saying, I want to leave my old life behind, and please accept me as your disciple. Please accept me as your disciple. Now, meanwhile, back at Yasa's home, his mother, Yasa's mum, wakes up and sees that Yasa's not home, and wakes Yasa's dad up and says, "Dad, Yasa's gone." Yep. So there's this kind of commotion happening in Yasa's home, where his mum says, "Your son, go and find him. He's disappeared. Go and find him." So Yasa's dad leaves to go and find his son. He might have seen footprints of the golden slippers. He follows them. Anyway, Yasa's dad ends up in the deer park. Now the Buddha sees him coming, and decides to hide Yasa. So this is an incredible kind of thing. He hides Yasa. Now, it's said he hides him with his supernormal powers, but maybe he just told Yasa to go hide behind a tree. I don't know. Anyway, Yasa is hidden from sight. His dad comes, sees the Buddha, and his dad says, "Do you know where my son is? Have you seen a young man in golden slippers?" And the Buddha says, "I think I might have done. Why don't you sit here, and I think he might turn up." So Yasa's dad sits down, and the Buddha starts teaching him the Dharma. And Yasa's dad seems really receptive to the Dharma. As Yasa's dad is being taught the Dharma, Yasa is listening, and Yasa suddenly gains full enlightenment. And his dad becomes a stream entrant, which is somebody who, again, has seen the Dharma to the point where they'll never be able to go back and forget it, as it were. They've seen the Dharma to a point which is irreversible. So Yasa's dad becomes a stream entrant. Yasa becomes enlightened. The Buddha then reveals Yasa to his father and says, "Here's your son." And his dad says, "Son, this is fantastic, but let's go home." And Yasa doesn't want to go back anymore. He doesn't feel that he can return to his old life. And the Buddha says to Yasa's father, he says, "Look, you've seen the truth of the Dharma. Imagine if your son had become fully enlightened. Would he go back to his old life? Would you go back if you were like that?" And Yasa's dad says, no, I wouldn't. I can well understand that my son wouldn't want to go back. Yasa wants to just become a disciple and follow the Buddha now. His dad says, "Well, at least, please come and have a meal with us." He invites the Buddha to have a meal at his family home, at his palace, and the Buddha agrees. And later on that day, the Buddha and Yasa go to Yasa's house, where they're served by this banquet by Yasa's mother and Yasa's wife. So he was married. So anyway, the Buddha eats the food, and then he starts teaching Yasa's mum and Yasa's wife the Dharma. They become stream entrants. They see the Dharma, and they ask to go for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha. They ask to become disciples. Yasa's dad and Yasa's mum and his wife are the first people to go for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha. Yasa's mum and his wife are his first women disciples. They're the first lay disciples in that they don't leave the family home and follow him. They don't become monks or nuns. And Yasa is another enlightened being. So this whole family drama of going from hedonism to enlightenment in one day. Yeah? It's quite something, isn't it? And not just Yasa, but his dad, his mum, his wife. Everybody's suddenly a disciple of the Buddha. So let me just pause there and see if you've got any questions. One question I've got for you is, do you kind of believe that? Do you believe that somebody can just become enlightened, having not practiced the Dharma, not been a truth seeker, been a party animal, suddenly have a kind of complete conversion, see the Dharma, gain enlightenment, all in one morning? What do you make of that?
So it makes it sound quite easy
Mm.
in a way. Whereas, like, we're not leaving here. Well, maybe some people are, but generally, you don't listen to a teaching and then become enlightened. So I find it, quite difficult to comprehend that he could be so lucky as to have that.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose the Buddha is, the main guy.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine, isn't it?
As you were saying about, it wasn't necessarily what he was teaching, it was the fact that it was coming from the Buddha, who was himself very recently enlightened.
Yeah.
That's not something we all have
Yeah.
access to necessarily.
That's right.
Personally, I do believe there is there's a yearning inside me from a personal point of view to get to
Yeah.
a kinder place.
Yeah.
And I can believe if I met someone who was on a very enlightened path, maybe that would be accelerated. So.
Yeah. Yeah. The impact of another person, an enlightened person. I think that's there's truth in that. I think that we can be profoundly influenced, impacted upon by people who are further along the path than we are. I've never met anybody who's enlightened, but I have met people who have had a profound influence on me just through their being. Sangha should have been one of them. Not as profound as to suddenly wake up to enlightenment, but profound enough to make me change my life. On my first retreat, which was, 24 years ago or something like that, well, actually, I remember two things. One is that I experienced pleasure in meditation and realised that was possible even for me to experience some pleasure in meditation. It wasn't huge pleasure. It wasn't the sort of ecstatic bliss that I have heard about since. But it was a little bit pleasurable. And that was enough to make me think that meditation did work. But more than that, I met people, some of the order members there, who I didn't know them very well, so I couldn't have judged whether they were how enlightened or not they were. But I met people who were definitely wiser than I was, and seemed kinder than I was, and seemed sincere in their practice in a way that was impressive. And it was that made me feel, okay, well, I could sort of relate to them as well. So it made me feel that I could perhaps practice with them, or I could learn from them. So I think I can only imagine what it might have been like to meet the Buddha and be taught by him. But if somebody was at all receptive, I think it would have had a profound impact. I think there are other ways of looking at it as well, though. Vishwapani in his book talks about how, he mentions briefly anyway, how later Buddhists might have elevated the experience that Yasa and others had to a higher level than was actually the case. The Buddhist tradition is not consistent about what enlightenment is. It's not different Buddhists will talk about enlightenment as different things. Yeah. So maybe the realization that Yasa had wasn't the ultimate realization. Maybe it was a genuine realization of the truth, but enough to completely change his life. But maybe it wasn't full and perfect enlightenment. And if that's the case, then I can relate to it more. On that first retreat, I did feel that my life was going to change. It wasn't that I had some huge enlightenment experience. It wasn't like that at all. It was just a deep, quiet knowing that I could never go back from this. I'd seen something that was true, and that I was never going to be able to go back. And I've met lots of people who have had similar experiences, often on retreat. Sometimes I've met people who have never meditated before, who have had some spontaneous experience of the Dharma, even without knowing that it was the Dharma, and it's changed them. It's changed them. Might be interesting just to see, do you relate to that? Have you had experiences that have changed you? Does anybody want to share any of them? You don't have to, but might be interesting to. Yeah.
I've got one on retreat in the summer when we were learning about the Brahma Mahabhas. I had a really profound experience with the metta. I just found it so wonderful. I didn't actually, when the bell kind of went, I was like, no, I really want to stay in this kind of state. It was just really powerful. And, kind of deepened my, I felt that moment was like a, I don't know, just a really powerful experience, and that's something I wanted to continue and and continue to deepen, I suppose.
And didn't you say something of the effect of that experience? Because I know experiences come and go and they fade. Did it have a lasting effect on you at all?
Yeah, and I think also in my metta practice as well, so initially I was kind of always disappointed with subsequent metta practices.
Right, yeah.
Reach this kind of
the height.
But it really kind of, I don't know, just made me think so much more about the kind of practice and also how in my life I could kind of carry out that metta.
Yeah.
As a person, and not just internally.
Yeah. It's like it starts. Experiences like that start to, if you reflect on them at all, they start to make us question about how we're living, don't they? They can start to have an impact on. Well, if I can experience this now, then what does it say about the rest of my life? One of the hallmarks of Dharmic experiences is that they feel true. Yeah, they feel truer than anything else. So even if you just have a very brief experience of the Dharma, it's impossible to deny its truth. And then that can be really challenging because the rest of our lives often aren't lived by that truth. So there can be this urge then to change our lives. And that doesn't mean that you can necessarily be transformed instantly, but what you can do is start to reorientate your energy, your intentions, your volitions, what you're doing with your life. And many of us know what that's like. And maybe Yasa was experiencing that at a higher level. The story goes on that Yasa's friends, because it's quite a small town, Yasa's friends hear of Yasa having left home and become a disciple of the Buddha. And of course they must all be curious as to what's happened. Some of them must have thought, hang on,